Hey everybody, it's Psybearslat back with another video, and today we're going to be looking at a Shrine of the Storms playthrough. I do take a few clips from a few different dungeon attempts of this run, so you might see in some clips I'm on my feral, some clips I'm on my tank, but it's just to give you a complete picture of all of the different ways that you can customize this dungeon. I did want to briefly highlight the different group compositions that you might want to consider for Shrine of the Storms. So this dungeon is very interrupt heavy, so I would build your group accordingly. Now I've shown you that you don't need a rogue for this dungeon, as Shroud isn't always required and there are routes that you can use to get around this, incorporating death skips and such. I would also mention, as it's so interrupt heavy, I would recommend a paladin tank or a shaman healer, though these are better suited options when your group is very ranged DPS heavy, as ranged DPS normally have quite a long cooldown on their interrupt, or they might not even have an interrupt at all. Ultimately, go with whatever composition you're comfortable, and if your group of friends happen to be 2 Shadow Priests and a Warlock, hey, you know what? Just have some fun with it, alright? Find the way that works for you. Oftentimes with Shrine of the Storms, you will have this enchanted emissary right at the beginning of the dungeon. If you have a rogue, they can sap and blind these mobs, or if you have a sap and cage, sap paralysis, whatever you may have, you can deal with this enchanted emissary and have it disappear, and then you can pull the rest of the mobs. Now a lot of groups will incorporate a bloodlust right at the very beginning of this dungeon here to get it on cooldown quickly, so you've got it back up again for the boss or just after the boss. This way you can squeeze an extra bloodlust into a run. Now the mobs you want to look out for in this first sector of the dungeon before the first boss are these spiritualists, which are going to cast this mending rapids, which just needs to be interrupted or stunned. That will just heal the mobs. You also want to look out for this Templar with his heavy blow, his cleave frontal attack, which will stun you, and if you're the tank, you definitely want to be out of that, so try and face them out of the rest of the group. And also with the Templar, the main thing that they're going to cast is this protection aura, and you want to make sure that it either gets interrupted or purged off with a Blood Elf Racial, a Shaman, or a Demon Hunter, because that will reduce the amount of damage that all of these surrounding mobs are taking, so you really don't want that cast to go through. Lastly, you want to look out for the Water Blasts that are being cast. These hit very, very hard, and most tanks aren't equipped to deal with more than a few casts going through. I would also advise that you want to look out for the anchors on the floor, the big swirlies. You don't want to stand in those because you will get rooted and it does a lot of damage. You'll also notice these snapshot techniques that we're using on these braziers here. This is a really good way to get a bunch of mobs to jump to you at once, and if you're wondering how this is done, you just want to make sure that as the tank you have aggro on all of the mobs. You jump onto these snapshot positions. You can even have your rogue Tricks of the Trade or a hunter misdirect if that's easier for the group. Now most groups will incorporate a shroud and a distraction here on this water elemental group, and they will quickly slide through the side there. However, oftentimes I like to include this water elemental into my route. You can see I make use of these braziers here to again snapshot all of these mobs quickly so the group can immediately start DPSing rather than wait for the mobs to slowly run to us. Also a neat trick you can do is when the Rising Surge is being cast, you can quickly line of sight it down the stairs and it stops you from being smacked up in the air, which means you're able to interrupt some of these spell casts. Sometimes if you get knocked up in the air and nobody can interrupt these water blasts, then your tank lands and just instantly dies. Another cool trick that you could do using these braziers again is snap this troublesome pack at the bottom of the stairs onto this brazier, which makes it way easier to deal with, especially on a necrotic week or a bursting week. And it also makes dealing with some of these emissaries a lot easier. Now most of you will know this first boss quite well. However, there are a few cute little nuances that not a lot of people seem to be aware of. So what I would do is use this boss as a way to pull additional trash to save time for later on in the run. But the last thing is when this boss actually splits apart, you want to make sure that you have at least one person in the group standing on each of these little eruptions. Otherwise, they will kind of have this mini enrage and they will do a lot of damage. So you want to make sure that you've got probably your healer on the stairs, your tank on the left side, and then all the DPS focus the one out on the right. So this is the first mini boss of the dungeon, Heldis. Most groups will incorporate a skip here, in which you just stand on this ledge and you jump across. You can also stealth it if you're a stealth class. However, sometimes some groups will opt to kill Heldis. Heldis herself will put a rune on the ground, so you want to make sure that you pull her out of that so she doesn't get an additional buff. She has a spell which you want to make sure you're interrupting. And then she will do this pulsating AoE ability, which you want to make sure that if you have any healing cooldowns here, or personal cooldowns, that you are incorporating this. Now Heldis is worth a lot of percent, but I personally prefer skipping her because I think it's way easier to pull 2 packs of mobs than it is to just kill one solo mob. Because really you don't want to kill Heldis and an extra group of mobs. It's at this point in the dungeon that we start to see a shift in the types of mobs that we're facing. So there's a caster mob which still does this water blast. There's also an additional caster mob that will cast this ability Tempest, which will put these little tornadoes on the ground and they will move in a straight line. If you get hit by this, it can often one-shot you, so you want to make sure that you either interrupt this spell or just move out. And lastly is the Attendant. You want to make sure that when they're doing this AoE mechanic, this big circle on the ground, that you are stunning these mobs or typhooning them, Ring of Peace, whatever you have to do. This way you can continue to maintain a high level of damage instead of having to stop and move out every time. I advise having your group wait outside here, and then as a tank you can go in and pull 2 packs and then pull them out and cleave them down together. Again, this is better percentage than Heldis. Directly after that, you would incorporate a Rogue Shroud. That's what most groups would do, because this mob here does this defensive rune, which just is a nuisance to have to kill, and oftentimes is a massive drain on defensive cooldowns. Next, you'll meet the Elemental, which most groups, again, don't really want to kill. It's a massive drain on offensive and defensive cooldowns, and again, isn't worth enough percent to warrant killing it. So you can have a rogue player, or, well, you can have any player pull this mob away as we're positioned here. We run through, and then that player can either, if they're a hunter, they can feign death and run back, or a rogue can just quickly sprint past the mob and vanish to reset. Ultimately, if this person dies, just res them and move on. Now I want to show you a really cool snapshot positioning here up against this wall, in which case as a tank you come and jump on this little position here. Any mobs that are taunted to you will immediately jump to this position. It makes gathering a bunch of mobs way easier, and can even help when you have an awkward enchanted emissary on the side. Now there's also the snapshot you can do using this pond in the middle. However, I oftentimes don't really like that because you have reduced movement. So once you get to this second boss, you want to briefly pause for a second and make sure you are concrete on who is interrupting when. You only need to cycle 3 interrupts on this boss, and a trick to this is to just make sure that, let's say you're interrupting third, well, just count the first 2 interrupts, and then once you interrupt, as soon as your interrupt is back available again, that is the cast that you want to interrupt. Also, an additional point on that is to download the Weak Aura, which I can link in the description. This is a really good interrupt tool where you can quickly and easily track the available interrupts in your group. Now you'll notice a lot of groups have started implementing this technique in order to kill this second boss, and I find it is without doubt the best way to do this. So far anyway. What you do as a tank is you position yourself on the lower level here, have these bosses running back and forth, always facing away from the group. This is to stop the cleave being positioned at any of your teammates. And what you do as a tank is to look out for these tornadoes on the ground and make sure that you move out of those. You also want to watch out for when the rune is placed. This is a defensive rune that will clear all of the dots that are on the bosses if the boss stands in them. It'll also reduce the amount of damage that they're taking. So it can be a real pain for any dotting classes if these bosses get run through this rune. Then all you have to do is worry about your interrupt rotation and make sure that all of the DPS and healer players are standing up on this ledge and not getting hit by any of these tornadoes or cleaves. However, do be careful when you interrupt. If you have a chargeable interrupt such as Feral Druids, then sometimes you can actually end up charging to the bosses down the ledge and get hit by tornadoes, so just be aware of that. So this next mob type that you encounter, the Ritualist, has 2 specific casts. One is an interruptible cast, which you just want to make sure you interrupt, otherwise it will do a large AoE to the whole of the group. It also has this Void ability, which is uninterruptible, though it can be stunned, Typhoon, Ring of Peace, etc. And this you just want to make sure that when it reaches 0 that you move out from the rest of your group. The Patrolling mob also does a deep smash ability, so as a tank you want to try and kite these mobs around. You don't really want to ever pull more than like maybe 2 or 3, as they do hit quite hard. They'll also drop swirlies around on the ground, so as a group you want to make sure that you don't stand in those. So if your group is not incorporating a death skip here and you are killing some of these mobs, then I'd recommend again using this brazier here in order to snapshot these mobs. This makes it very easy to deal with if there's a Tides emissary or an enchanted emissary. And if nothing else, it just looks really cool and will get you invited back to groups. 100%. So if you are incorporating a death skip at this point, just want to make sure that your tank leads you through the mobs here. A lot of groups will die directly after you make it through this first little end cave, and then make use of a battle res or an ank or what have you. Some groups will then look to kill some of these mobs on this bridge pack. However, this isn't a very well-versed group of mobs. Most people don't know how to deal with many of these mobs. So I would instead look to get your percentage elsewhere and actually just incorporate a full skip of the whole bridge and then die. It means that way you don't need to worry about using a rogue shroud, so you don't even need to build your group around having a rogue. In fact, most of the skips in Shrine of the Storms can actually be done without a rogue, using just invis pots or having somebody else make the pulls themselves. However, this may incur some deaths. Another cool trick when it comes to death skipping this bridge is a more recent technique that's just started being used. I don't have clips of it myself as I haven't started practicing it yet. However, what you would do is have your tank mount up on a druid in stag form. You then run up these stairs just here into this initial enclave. And if you jump at the right point, then the mobs will all try and snapshot to the tank. However, because they're unable to reach the tank on the druid's back, they end up bugging out and evading, and when you actually run through the room, all of the mobs, even the mobs inside of the room, will just reset. This is really cool on Horde if you don't have access to Shadow Meld, obviously. You can still do a death skip here without the death. Though if you're on Alliance, just pop Shadow Meld forehead. Once you make it into the third boss room, you want to make sure that you have your healer quickly run to the third boss and initiate the RP. Then they can come back and make sure that they're healing you and whatnot. This is a good point to incorporate any AoE stuns that you can. On the third boss himself, all you need to worry about is the one interruptible cast, so again just have some form of interrupt cycle here. Look out for the orbs that spawn on the ground. You don't want to knock into those unless you get mind controlled. If you are mind controlled, there are two ways to deal with this. You can either soak the orbs available and then have your DPS kill you for the remainder of the damage. You need to be taken down to roughly, I think it's anywhere between 50 and 60-ish% or so before you become unmind controlled. Then there's also the way of jumping into the jacuzzi and taking a little dip. What you need to do is jump into the water and go a little bit under the water level, though be careful. What I like to do is get myself to around about 65, 70-ish% health. Then I'll come out of the water and soak a few bubbles. Because what can happen if the mind control breaks and you're in the water and you're too slow swimming back up, then it ends up ticking for more of your health and you die. So once you make it to this final boss room, you can let your inner weeb fully be infused as you get suckled by eels, tantalized by tentacles, and most likely deplete due to a poor interrupt rotation. We've all been there, haven't we? What I would ultimately recommend on this last boss room is to skip all of the mob packs here and just go straight for the last boss. For those of you that don't know, the healer in your party will get a stacking debuff on them, which will increase their damage done massively. However, it will lower their maximum amount of health, which means they're prone to being one-shot by any of the mechanics that occur in this room. So you want to make sure as DPS that you're doing everything that you can to protect your healer, and as a tank, make sure anything that your healer is attacking has been taunted. Once your healer has this buff, you can then kill the remainder of the trash in the room way quicker, because your healer will be pumping out the most amount of damage of anybody in the group. So what I like to do with this boss, as a tank, is position him at the very back of the room. And you can be very, very efficient with how you're placing these pools on the ground from the Yawning Gate ability. This way you just want to slowly kite the boss around the back of the room, hugging the back wall. Meanwhile, you want to look out for the tentacle slams that are smacking on the ground. Do not be in front of them. Once you descend into the Shadow Realm, you want to believe in the heart of the interrupts and make sure that you have a foolproof interrupt rotation. Now I like to represent this interrupt rotation using a pixel perfect representation of the boss fight. You need to make sure that these mobs don't get their cast off, otherwise it will full health heal them, cause an AoE damage ability, which if your healer is caught in will kill them. Remember, your healer and tank are in a different Shadow Realm, and once they kill their mob, they get ported into the DPS Shadow Room, if they kill theirs quicker, of course. Which means, if the healer jumps into your Shadow Realm with this debuff ability on them, reducing their maximum health, and one of the tentacle casts gets off, then it's going to kill your healer. So I found the best interrupt rotation for the group is to have all of the DPS focus one of the mobs. You have two people, say Billy and Bobby, interrupting the first two casts of that mob, and then it should be dead. You want to make sure that you interrupt right at the very end of the spell cast. So in this representation, you would have Bobby interrupt the first one, Billy interrupt the second, and Susan not doing anything. However, there will also be a second range dab, and you can let the first cast go through, because chances are that your tank and healer are not that good, and they haven't killed their mob within like 10 seconds. So you let this first cast through and just take the damage hit. You then want to make sure that you have Susan, for example, interrupt the second cast of the faraway ad right at the last second. This then gives Bobby enough time to regenerate their interrupt in order to be used on the third cast of the far ad. Now in this technique, your healer is definitely going to be safe no matter when they kill that ad. And as long as everybody performs their interrupt correctly, you've got no problems. I know it feels like I'm really milking this interrupt rotation, but you will not believe how many groups I've seen get to this point with more than enough time to complete the key, and they wipe due to a simple misunderstanding of when interrupt should be used. Once you exit the Shadow Realm, you can then kill this mob pack in the middle with the help of the healer's increased damage, as well as a similar interrupt rotation. Once you're back on the boss, you want to make sure that you bloodlust and use all of your cooldowns to try and kill this boss within one phase if possible. Watch out for the little voidlings which will start moving towards the boss. Try and CC these and keep them away from the boss, because if they reach the boss, then it will add energy to the boss's energy pool, which means that he will go into the next Shadow Realm sooner. So you want to avoid this. If you kill these little voidlings, then they will erupt in an AoE effect, which can potentially kill your healer, so be careful of this. So this week I don't have a tip for you per se, but more of a discussion point, and I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments section. I want to bring up the notion of simming yourselves for dungeons. I know many of you out there will do this in order to figure out what might be best for you in that scenario. So let's hear from you then. What are the pros and cons that you found when simming? What are the pitfalls? What are the things that not many people might know when simming for dungeons? Alright, well I hope you enjoyed this one, and I look forward to the next one with you. See you again.